Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lecture. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on debate on nation state in comparative politics, and for this discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is a prolific professor who believes in giving his maximum knowledge to the students. Dear friends, throughout his academic career he is involved in giving his best to the students, his utmost knowledge to the students, and through the live platform he makes the subject easier and understandable. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to explain us in detail today's topic. Hello sir, welcome to the
Thank you Geetika ji, and good afternoon. Today's discussion we are going to have on the concept of nation state in comparative politics. In fact, in earlier lectures we discussed the concept of a state, that how the state formation has happened in history and how comparative politics has come to terms with this entire phenomenon called state, contemporary state, so to say. Today's topic is devoted to the question of nation state, because one thing we should remember that the state is not new to human history. It has evolved through ages. Even in ancient time we have had instances when thinkers talked about state, its role, its functions, its origin, and so on and so forth. Of course, in modern time this entire discussion on a state acquired new salience and new significance. But what is more important about this topic, that is nation state, that here we are not going to discuss the state in isolation, but in conjunction with another concept, that is nation. And therefore this entire idea of nation state becomes very important for social science as a whole and political science and comparative politics in particular. So therefore, what is this idea of nation state? That is perhaps the topic for today's discussion. In course of our discussion, we will touch upon various dimensions, and this discussion will be basically divided into two parts. Today is part one of our discussion, part one of our lecture on the debate on nation state in comparative politics, and it will be followed by the second part. So what in fact we will try to do in course of our two parts discussion on nation state. Number A, to trace the entire concept, that what is nation and what is a state, what is the relationship between the two, how nation is to be differentiated from from ethnicity, from nationality, and so on and so forth. And then we will see the evolution, the formation of nation state through evolutionary process, that how different factors like capitalism, breakdown of empire, independence of colonial territories, disintegration of large federal states, particularly Soviet Union, USSR, all these factors have basically can be considered as factors which have basically contributed towards the rise of nation state. So therefore, in fact, this is one, that is the evolutionary process. But at the same time, we will also discuss that how different treaties in the world, particularly in modern times, important treaties like Treaty of Westphalia and Warsaw Treaty, how they have contributed towards stabilization as well as regulation of the entire idea around the nation state, particularly through the concept of sovereignty, be it the question of a standing army, be it the rule of the conduct, the rule of negotiation, rule of residence, all important factors which have gone into making nation state what it is today. So how these treaties have contributed. Along with these treaties, we will also touch upon various revolutions of modern times, particularly French Revolution 1789, American War of Independence, and then of course the way Latin America, the settler nationalism surfaced and emerged in Latin American continent, and then of course how it moved in different areas, different parts of the globe, including the Commonwealth countries like Australia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and not to forget India, particularly after 1950. So how this idea of nation emerged through number of trajectories, number of processes, both from the point of view of revolution, from the point of view of global treaties, from the point of view of constitutionalism. That is something important to remember. And then of course I will also discuss the challenges to nation state in modern times, and the challenges are very significant, and particularly after the advent of this concept of globalization, that how new challenges have emerged, how nation is basically today being seen, is seen as a concept which is finding difficult to come to terms with the idea of democracy, come to terms with the question of globalization, come to terms with many other issues. That will also be part of our discussion, if not today then definitely in the next part, particularly challenges before the nation state in today's context. That is new nationalism, how it is becoming a new phenomenon, that new nationalism largely dependent on this entire concept of ethnicity or nativism, cultural exclusivity, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the issues we will try to touch upon in course of our discussion. But before we move to our other parts, particularly this treaty and the revolutions, there are few issues which require our attention. That is, how do we understand this entire question of nation? Because one thing is to be remembered, that there is a difference between nation or nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism is not new to human history. In fact, patriotism is also not specific to human species. In fact, even non-human species, even animals are patriotic. For example, it is often said that cat is so patriotic, particularly the territorial affinity and patriotism is so much in the cat that it will basically refuse to move from a place. So therefore, patriotism is a love for territory, is not something new to human history. But what is new to human history is this entire concept of nation, which at times is referred as an ideology, because it is believed that it is a modern phenomenon. It has emerged in 16th century, particularly in Europe, and gradually spread in different parts of the world. And therefore, this entire debate on nationalism, because sometimes it is seen and presented in positive terms, sometimes it is also presented in negative terms. For example, there have been many internationalists in political thought, in theory, who have basically not thought much of nation and nationalism, because they believe that this is something which divides humanity, that militates against the human values, and therefore one should think in terms of larger human values, humanity, and human society, instead of dividing this entire world into this territorial nation states or territorial nationalities. For example, Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet, philosopher, thinker, can be put in this category. There was of course another brand of internationalism which emanated from Marxism and socialism, which believed in a global working class society, global working class solidarity, and talked of different type of internationalism. Otherwise also we find that nation and nationalism have been considered responsible for giving birth to two world wars, the World War I and World War II. And therefore there have been a very lively debate on this question, that whether nationhood, nationalism are good for humanity or they are to be detested, they are to be abjured, and they have to be kept aside. Even Gandhi, who thought of human values, who talked in terms of humanity, in fact, of course, used nation, particularly Indian nationalism, to get Indians out of the colonial bondage or slavery. But of course, his entire idea was much more nuanced so far as nation is concerned. Of course, there was a debate between Tagore and Gandhi on this issue, because when Gandhi launched his civil disobedience non-cooperation movement, in fact, Tagore thought that it was not good for humanity, because even if it is non-violent, but nonetheless you are using a method for a cause that is nation, is perhaps cannot be an ideal for Indian people. So therefore these issues are there. But what has happened, that in modern time it has become the most stable concept, it has become the most dominant ideology, so much so that entire world is under grip of nation and nationalism, and therefore nation state is an important reality of today's life. even this global system, United Nations, in fact, which emerged after Second World War, basically, looks at this entire world in terms of nation states. The membership of United Nations is based on nation state. So therefore, it is an important part of today's human history or today's reality. So therefore, there is no running away from this. In fact, whatever challenges which have happened in history on this question of nation state have been successfully taken care of, be it communist internationalism or be it globalization or the capitalist globalization, so to say, or for that matter any other challenge which has been thrown on this question of nationhood and nationalism. This is considered to be perhaps most stable, most durable, and perhaps most effective ideology in modern times. Therefore, entire world is today divided in terms of these identities which are basically based on this question of nation, nationalism, and nation state. Of course, there are many thinkers. For example, Benedict Anderson, when he called it imagined community, he said it's not a real community. It is imagination. It exists in imagination. And here, scholars make distinction between nation and a state. Nation is a subjective disposition, where a state is objective manifestation, or one can say objective reality. One can sense various institutions and apparatuses of the state. But whereas the nation is concerned, it only exists at the level of consciousness, at the level of sentiments, at the level of feeling. Therefore, it is a subjective disposition of human beings. So therefore, there is a difference between nation and the state. But what has happened, that even if it is a subjective disposition, or if you go by Benedict Anderson's characterization as imagined community, this imagination has basically caught the minds of the people so much that there is hardly any society today which is not clamoring for or which is not under the grips of this ideology called nationalism. So this is something we should remember. Now, before I move to this entire question of the formation of a state through evolutionary process, the factors which have contributed, in fact, let me first make a distinction between ethnicity and nationality, because nationalism comes out of nationality, and nation state is basically the crystallization or articulation of this entire question of nationalism and nationality. So what is the difference between ethnicity and nationality? Now, it is normally believed that for nationality 4 things are required. One is language, another is territory, third is culture, and fourth is history. And if you have 4 factors, and particularly territory becomes important, if people living on a particular patch of land have territorial affinity, then of course they develop a sense of nationality, or one can say that that a group can be called a nationality, or that ethnic group can be called a nationality. Whereas when other factors are maybe present, but the territorial affinity is absent, then of course it cannot be called a nationality, rather it becomes an ethnic group. So therefore, it is normally argued that when there is a disjunction between territory and culture, disjunction between territory and culture, then you have ethnicity. If there is a conjunction between territory and culture, then you have nationality. Therefore, at times it is argued that in today's context in India, most of the groups are ethnic groups, not nationality, except perhaps the Sikhs in Punjab and the tribals in the northeastern states who have some sort of territorial affinity. Otherwise, most of the groups are free-floating groups having no territorial affinity, the way perhaps there was before the partition in 1947 of the subcontinent. So therefore, this ethnicity and nationality, these 2 concepts have to be seen. So now what happens is nationality. When nationality, I have already made a distinction between ethnicity and nationality. When nationality or a group which can be considered as a nationality, when develops a consciousness about themselves, with a sense of history, culture, with language, with territorial affinity, that consciousness, creates that sense of nationhood, that they are a nation. And when that consciousness comes, and when there is a clamor, the urge, quest for self-determination, that as a nation, they need self-determination. They have to have self-rule, self-government. then perhaps the nationhood basically becomes a dominant ideology among that group. And when there is, of course, a movement, a political a movement, or one can say a political clamor for that, then it becomes nationalism. And when that nation basically coexists with a statehood or the state institutions, or in other words, one can say that when the cultural boundaries coincide with the political boundaries of the people, then one can say that a nation state comes into existence. Of course, in today's world, it is often argued that it is difficult to find such a entity today, that is a monocultural nation state, because there is hardly any instance today when this cultural boundaries and political boundaries neatly coincide, or one can say that they are basically in harmony with each other, because most of the states today are becoming multilingual, multicultural, plural, largely on account of migration, largely on account of many other factors, and therefore multiculturalism is perhaps the most talked about theory in political theory and social science. So therefore, we should remember that how nation state comes into existence when the cultural boundaries and political boundaries basically coincide. And as I mentioned, that there are very few instances in today's world when you can find such a neat such a neat harmony between political boundaries and cultural boundaries. Of course, there are also instances when nations have existed without any statehood. For example, in fact, the Palestinians, were considering, they were believed, or they not only themselves believed, but the others also thought of them as a nation. But they didn't have a statehood. But still they, considered themselves a nation, and large number of people in the world also accorded them that sanctity, that they are a nation. So nation can exist without a state. Sometimes a state also exists without nation. But nonetheless, this coexistence of nation and state is perhaps a very dominant concept of modern times. And therefore, when we talk of nation state, it is suggestive of perhaps that ideology which I was mentioning, because patriotism may have existed in past, in ancient and medieval time, but this nationhood and or the concept of nation state is purely modern phenomenon which can be traced to 17th century, particularly Treaty of Westphalia, which I will be basically referring to in later part of our discussion. So this is something we should remember. There are many theories about this entire question of nation and nationalism. For example, two things we should remember. Two scholars, and that scholarship is important because there are two ways nation and nationalism today are discussed, or nation state is discussed. One is ethnic nationalism, which is also very important today. What has happened, that this ethnic nationalism, or which is at times referred as the primordial nationalism, which is seen as eternal, present both in the past and the present of a society or among groups, and therefore this entire primordial realities around ethnicity, around caste, around religion, around language, it is considered eternal, and therefore this type of understanding of nationalism gives rise to ethnic nationalism. This is perhaps the most common dominant understanding of nationalism in social science. In fact, this is how perhaps nation and nationalism emerged in modern history, particularly in Europe, when language became the dominant characteristic of this entire nationhood. Of course, there are other instances. For example, in other parts of the world, not language, but religion became the cementing factor. Religion became the chief characteristic of nation building or nation formation. Of course, there are also instances where neither language nor religion, but some other set of factors became responsible for rise of nationhood. And here one can cite the example of United States of America, which is considered or which is believed to be a nation based on republican values, democratic values, neither religion nor language, what is often referred as civic nationalism. or what Habermas called constitutional patriotism. In fact, not only United States of America, but India also is referred as another instance in the similar mold. So therefore, this is something we should remember about primordial or ethnic nationalism. The second brand is the constructivist or the modernist version of this theory on nationalism, and it argues that nationalism is socially constructed and therefore it is a modern identity. And this entire idea of civic nationalism comes out of this constructivism or the modernist understanding of nationalism. For example, the way Benedict Anderson talked about imagined community, that how imagination was propelled by a set of factors, which I will be discussing shortly. So therefore, this is another argument, another theory on this question of nationalism. In fact, there is one scholar of nationalism and nation state, Anthony D. Smith. He has tried to bridge this gap between ethnic nationalism and constructivism, and he uses the term ethne, and his usage of this term ethne is suggestive of something quite significant, because he believes that his ethne is different from ethnicity, and ethne in Smith's framework is the core of nation building. For example, he will give the example of Great Britain, that how this ethne became the core of the nation building there. So therefore, in fact, this is what Smith talks about, this ethnic nationalism, that how this ethne becomes the core of this entire nation building project or the nation state project. So this is how one has to see that how this ethnic nationalism and the constructivist understanding or the modernist version of nationalism, how this theory believes that nation is constructed through a social process, historical process, may not be simply the work of a ethnic group or may not be the work of this ethne. So therefore, this is something quite significant from the point of view of the theories of nation and nationalism. Of course, one thing is also important here, that the uses or the concept of nation and nation state has also undergone changes over the period of time in history. The uses earlier period was totally different. For example, earlier it was considered to be only associated with elites, and gradually it got transformed linguistically, and semantic transformation was significant, and it got associated with the whole people. So therefore, nation became synonymous with the people, and it is here that one important work which has been done on this question of nation and nationalism is to be remembered, and the work is by a very eminent theorist of nation and nationalism, Leah Greenfield, and the Greenfield has explained that how the change in semantics of nation in 13th century, when nation meant a community of opinion, nation was a group of social elites, and gradually by 16th century a transformation happened, the semantic transformation, and the entire reference of nation got changed. And it applied to the entire population of a country, because and became synonymous with the people. So this is how this symbolic transformation of these uses and the concept of nation from 13th to 16th century, which is basically Leah Greenfield has explained graphically through his writing, tells us that how the uses of the nation has not been uniform throughout the history, and therefore this change was symbolic according to Greenfield, because it led to the elevation of the rabble into the elite, and basically rabble into elite and the people changed the way the people imagined from a hierarchical to communities to a more free and equal citizens, which became synonymous with democracy. And therefore, this explanation is quite significant, because the idea of basic rule of society as stemming from the common action of people of a nation is identical with the democratic idea for which society is, for which the sovereignty is located among the people, that is equality among people or the equal rights of the people. Now, Greenfield therefore argues that nationalism was the form in which democracy appeared in the world. because as many of us know that modernity seems to have led to number of changes in society, including capitalism, Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, and above all the democratic process and democratic ideas. So all were, even if not synchronic in terms of time and space, but nonetheless broadly we can say that they emerged from 15th, 16th century to 19th century, particularly in Europe. So therefore, in fact, according to Greenfield, that nationalism was the form in which democracy appeared. Democracy didn't appear separately, but initially it appeared through this transformation from the elite concept to the people's concept, when the sovereignty was considered to be lying with the people, and therefore democracy appeared in the world in form of nation and nationalism. And in fact, he goes to the extent of saying that democracy, the idea of this entire nation and nationalism contained within itself the idea of democracy. So therefore democracy the nation contained democracy as a butterfly in cocoon. This is the argument of Greenfield. So what I am basically trying to mention here, that this entire concept of nation and nationalism has not simply come just with a stroke. There has been a pattern of evolution, and therefore that evolution is quite significant. And therefore, in fact, 2-3 important developments in history have to be underlined here. Particularly, the way the developments like capitalism, the breakdown of empire, and independence of colonial territories in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and particularly later on in 20th century, the way federal states or the socialist state of Soviet Union are disintegrated. All these factors in one way or other have from time to time shaped and influenced this entire formation of a nation state in the world. But before we see that how this process got propelled, this is also important to remember that how this authority of nation state got shaped in history. And it is here that I was mentioning earlier about 2 important treaties in modern history. One is the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, and subsequently the Warsaw Treaty. How these treaties led to 4 important developments in human society. One was that how this entire concept of army, state army, the army at the disposal of state got institutionalized. How it created the rule of the conduct among the various state authorities and state powers. And the third, how it created a rule of negotiation, that how treaties have to be negotiated, how laws have to be negotiated, how interstate relationship has to be negotiated. And fourthly, that how it created a rule of residence, that how residence becomes an important legal framework through which national identities will be basically will be created. This is what today we call citizenship. Citizenship rights, citizenship entitlements, and citizenship concepts. So these 4 important rules of conduct, of negotiation and residence, along with the army, perhaps emerged with these important treaties. So treaties have played important role along with the revolution, which we will be discussing shortly.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us in-depth knowledge on today's topic. And dear friends, please be with us as we are going to continue further and would be discussing more, and keep watching us. Hello friends, welcome back to this session where we are discussing on nation, state and comparative politics, and for this discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Friends, if you want to ask questions from Dr. Satish Kumar Jha on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. Now I would like to request Dr. Satish Kumar Jha to continue further and kindly give us in-depth knowledge on today's topic.
Thank you. In fact, what we are discussing earlier was that how the treaties, various treaties in modern times have shaped this entire concept and entire process through which this nation state has got stabilized and crystallized in modern period. And here in this context I was mentioning about Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. In fact, a treaty which is also remembered for giving four essential attributes of a state, that is territory, population, government and sovereignty. But it was not confined to only these four attributes, but as I was mentioning, that along with another treaty, the Treaty of Warsaw, what we find that these two treaties in fact prepared the ground for this entire new identity around which the people have today lived, that is the nation state. And therefore, be it the army, the rule of the conduct, a rule of negotiation, and the residence, which is basically rule of residence, which is synonymous with the entire concept of citizenship, basically got crystallized, crystallized through these two important treaties and number of other treaties subsequently. But these two treaties are historic. But at the same time, I was also mentioning that certain revolutions are important, and in that context, the French Revolution, which is believed to have created the first Westphalian model of a state in the world, monolingual, that is the French state after this revolution 1789. So therefore, we find that revolutions have also contributed along with the treaties, but not only French Revolution, but another revolution, that is American War of Independence of 76-77, or the Philadelphia Convention, when the first written federal constitution was drafted. It is a different matter that many scholars refuse to call United States of America as a nation state, and rather they would prefer to call it a federal state, because it militates against or goes against this entire premise on which this Westphalian model of a statehood is created, or the nation state is created, because it believes in a federal model of government which is basically premised on an idea of shared rule and of course to some extent one can say self-rule also. So therefore, this shared rule which goes against this entire concept of monistic concept of sovereignty, which was the hallmark of this Westphalian nation state. So therefore, many scholars refuse to call it a nation state in true sense of the term. But nonetheless, there is no denying the fact that United States of America is another trajectory or another model through which one can understand evolution of nation state in modern times. But not only French and American, but there are other instances which I will also mention later. For example, the way entire concept moved to Latin American continent, which is known as settler nationalism. Then the way it moved to Europe, this entire concept of federal nation state, the way it moved to Europe in Switzerland, and subsequently it traveled to Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even India. So therefore, the revolutions have played important role so far as the evolution of nation state is concerned. Along with the revolutions, there is also United Nations Charter, and its significance cannot be minimized, particularly the way United Nations has created a charter, particularly after its formation after the Second World War. So in United Nations in fact is another important development in terms of this stabilization of this concept of nation. As I was mentioning, though it is a global community, international multilateral bodies, but nonetheless it works through nation states. So therefore, it has given new sanctity and legitimacy to this entire concept of nation and nation state in modern times. So therefore, this is something very important to remember, that how United Nations is also important development in modern times. Now, apart from these 3-4 factors which I have mentioned, global treaties, revolutions, United Nations Charter, we should also remember that rise of regionalism and globalization in modern times, particularly recent times, are equally important so far as this entire evolution of nation state is concerned, because it is a new development, new type of development. On the one hand, scholars argue that it has weakened the authority of nation state, but on the other hand, one can also argue that it has created a new framework through which nation states can be understood in changed situation and changed times. When we talk of regionalism, essentially, it refers to the European Union, the kind of regionalism which emerged in the Europe, the kind of regionalism which emerged in Europe with European Union, where voluntarily nation states surrendered some aspects of their sovereignty and basically tried to come together, along with globalization, which to some extent is considered to have compromised this entire idea of national sovereignty. But nonetheless, today what we find that nation states are surviving along with this process of globalization. So therefore, these factors have to be kept in mind when we are discussing nation state in comparative politics, that how these developments in political economy, how these developments in international law, how these developments in civil society, how these developments in larger human society have basically influenced this entire concept of nation state. Of course, nation state has survived. In fact, nation state has survived through number of challenges. For example, the challenge of global capitalism. It has survived through Soviet internationalism. It has survived United Nations multilateralism, but nonetheless one can say that nation state is still the dominant ideology of human society. So therefore, the challenges are there. The new set of challenges have come. How nation state is pitted against those challenges is also going to be discussed in the later part of our discussion, particular second part of our discussion. But this is something important. So therefore, the treaties part, which I was mentioning earlier, that how the Treaty of Westphalia and Warsaw Treaty, these two treaties are significant from the point of view of this emergence and evolution of nation state. Now, the revolutions I was mentioning, the next important dimension so far as the evolution of nation state is concerned. The first important revolution I was referring to was 1789, that is the French Revolution, which created a monolingual state. This was the first Westphalian state in human history. Of course, here we should remember that United Kingdom was a kind of a deviant case, because United Kingdom was not created by by the kind of process through which other states were created. The United Kingdom was created by treaties, and through treaties various nationalities were welded together, and therefore it was not a federal state, but nonetheless it was a kingdom united through treaties. But the first important federal state which I mentioned was the American War of Independence, which created this federal state in 1777, 76-77, and subsequently 1787, that is the Philadelphia Convention and the rise of a first federal state in human history. I was mentioning about the settler nationalism of Latin America, that how the Spanish and the Portuguese domination in Latin America got weakened, particularly after its war with France. After French invasion, particularly the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the way Louis Bonaparte, when he invaded Spain and Portugal, and their domination, their control on Latin America got weakened, a new type of uprising happened in Latin America. And here one should remember Simon Bolivar and many other revolutionaries of Latin America. So therefore, in fact, in 19th century, early 19th century, Latin American continent witnessed a new churning about nationalism and nation state, and at times it is referred as settler nationalism. So therefore, this was basically the third another instance through which this concept of nation state, after two important treaties and two important revolutions, in fact spread in other continents apart from Europe and North America. Then of course I was mentioning that how this concept of a federal state traveled to Switzerland in 1848 when the first federal state came into existence with number of innovative ideas. And finally I was mentioning that how decolonization after the Second World War led to the expansion of this global community, and this entire concept of nation state again acquired a new salience, a new meaning. And it is here that I was referring that the debates around this question of nation and nationalism, even within the socialist communist international, Comintern, there was a fierce debate on this issue, because Marxism as an ideology considered nation and nationalism to be product of capitalism. It considered to be an ideology and therefore false consciousness, cannot be the real consciousness. The real community, the real consciousness would come only through the working class solidarity, through the class struggle, and therefore it believed in different type of internationalism of workers as a result of capitalist exploitation. But when it came to nationalism in colonies, there was a heated debate within the Communist International, and it is here one should remember that famous debate between Lenin and M.N. Roy, the Indian thinker who at that time was part of international communist movement, who later on came out of this and became a radical humanist. But this debate was on this issue, that what approach the Communist International has to adopt vis-a-vis nationalism in the colonies, whether it is progressive or regressive. Lenin thought that nationalism in colonies should be seen differently from what normally is understood about nationalism in context of advanced capitalist countries, because here the subjugation of the people, exploitation of the people, deprivation of the people are getting channelized through this consciousness, nationalist consciousness. And therefore Lenin had argued that Gandhi led nationalist movement in India or the basically nationalism of Shanayat Sen and others in China have to be differentiated from nationalism in advanced capitalist countries. So therefore decolonization on the one hand led to this heated debate, on the other hand a different model of nationhood, and that model is significant. But within this process of nationhood formation, as I was mentioning, that normally scholars make a distinction between other models of nation state and the Commonwealth model of nation state. And the Commonwealth model of nation state is not is associated with Canada, is associated with Australia, is also associated with New Zealand, is associated with South Africa, and later on also associated with India. That how these Commonwealth erstwhile colonies of Britain, when they got independence, their formation of nationhood was different in constitutional and legal terms, and therefore this Commonwealth model, which is considered a parliamentary federal model, which combined the experiences of Britain and experiences of America in terms of their constitutional history, is a different way they try to institutionalize their entire idea of nation and the state. So therefore that was another model which I was mentioning, that is after this Commonwealth model of this thing. Now one thing is to be remembered, that what happened, that this entire concept of nation state, as I was mentioning, has come out of a number of processes, but the two things are very significant so far evolution of nation state is concerned. One is capitalism, another is industrialism. Because capitalism and industrialism have contributed more than perhaps any other factors so far as the evolution of nation state is concerned. Because industrialization triggered the emergence of nation state. This is the opinion of many scholars. In fact, people like personalities like Bismarck in Germany or Garibaldi in Italy, they definitely played important role in shaping the nation state in Germany and Italy. But nonetheless, the main motivation behind this entire idea of nation state came from 2-3 set of factors. First was the urge or the quest to enlarge the market, the capitalist market, capital market. This was perhaps the driving force at that time, which is associated with the rise of capitalism. The second was to create a more efficient system for the collection of taxes in order to invest it for the rise and growth of capitalism. So therefore, in fact, this was another important motivation, and therefore it is not off the mark if we argue that capitalism in more than one sense led to the rise of modern nation state in Europe. This is how perhaps Marxism also looked at the concept of nation, that how from feudalism, when this transition took place towards capitalism, there was a need to unify the markets, because feudalism stood for a localized production and localized consumption. Feudalism basically splintered the market, whereas there was a need for the bourgeois class for unification of market for more effective movement and circulation of capital. And this is how perhaps the nation states crystallized in history. The forces were the material forces, that is the forces of capitalism. In fact, Benedict Anderson, I was referring to earlier, his a monumental work on nationalism, nation state, that is imagination as imagined community. Benedict Anderson mentions certain factors as contributory factors so far as this nation state is concerned. According to Anderson, the first important factor which contributed to the rise of this idea of nation state was the printing press. Along with printing press, Anderson mentions the vernacular scholarship in lexicon, particularly in lexicography and the grammar. That is the shift from Latin, which was the classical elite discourse, to the German, is perhaps symptomatic of this transformation. So printing press, rise of vernacular scholarship, vernacular language, which is also considered very important for rise of modernity, and these two developments in fact enhanced the consciousness among people about their linguistic consciousness and other cultural identities, and therefore according to Anderson, that these two factors played a very important role for the rise of a modern nation state. Of course, there are other factors also mentioned by Anderson. For example, the archival, the creation of archive, monument, and many other things. But nonetheless, these two factors are very important. In fact, Anderson refers that Hungary and Poland are the best example of this category, that how these developments consolidated that identity around that linguistic communityhood and so on and so forth. But along with these factors, one cannot also forget that how much important role the breakdown of empire played in modern times. And breakdown of empire, when I talk of, essentially I mean the breakdown of three or four important empires, imperial regimes in the modern times. And one was Austro-Hungarian, the disintegration and the collapse of Austro-Hungarian Empire. The next was the collapse of Ottoman Empire, and the third was the collapse of the Tsarist regime in Russia. And nation states, of course, particularly in West Asia and Europe, particularly in Balkans, emerged out of this disintegration of these empires. So therefore, what we find that apart from these revolutions, United Nations Charter, democracy, rise of regional groupings like European Union or United Nations, in fact what we find that these factors have equally contributed, that is industrialization, capitalism, and the breakdown of empire. Of course, the challenges I have already mentioned earlier, and we will discuss those challenges much more detailed manner in the later part of our discussion. That is the challenges of global capitalism in form of globalization, Soviet internationalism, United Nations multilateralism, how these challenges along with the new phenomenon like religious exclusivity, religious exclusivism, terrorism, ethnic and sectarian challenges. These are the new challenges before the nation state today. And therefore, how it comes to terms with these challenges will basically determine its future course of evolution and its working. Along with, the kind of problematic relationship nation state is having with democracy. that is another important thing, particularly from the point of view of majoritarianism, because any nation which is inclusive has larger longevity in terms of time and space, but any nation which shrinks that plural character, which basically contracts and becomes exclusive in terms of conceptual frame, it creates problems for itself. So therefore, its engagement with democracy, its engagement with secularism are also important variables so far as the future survival of a nation state is concerned. And comparative politics basically looks at these issues these days in a more profound way. And therefore, in the second part of our discussion, we'll look at these issues. But before we move to those challenges, one thing is very clear, that this evolution has been, has happened largely on account of not one factor but number of factors, and it is in this context that the breakdown of empire I was mentioning. One thing is to be remembered, that this decolonization in Asia and Africa was also a significant issue, because at times nation state, concept of nation state is directly pitted against this concept of self-determination, particularly in today's world, particularly in era of globalization, when the sovereignty of nation state at times comes under stress. So therefore, what is this self-determination? In what context this self-determination is to be legitimized, and in what context it has to be simply spurned? So this is an important issue. Now, after decolonization, when many erstwhile colonies in Asia and Africa and Latin America became independent after Second World War, United Nations recognized them as a separate I recognize them as a legitimate entities in world politics, and therefore there was expansion of global community, and these nation states, newly independent states, became the member of United Nations. But United Nations at the same time also created a separate permanent organ that was called Trusteeship Council, and this Trusteeship Council acted as a midwife in the process of recognizing this newly independent states and their induction into United Nations system. So therefore, this painful transition through which these states passed around that time, and it was facilitated by United Nations through this Trusteeship Council. In fact, largely on account of this, we find that there was a manifold expansion of the membership of United Nations. But of course, one thing is to be remembered, that in this context the right to self-determination was understood in a different terms, in a different sense. For example, what happened, that the self-determination at that time was understood as a legitimate concept in context of colonial situation, and therefore colonialism became the defining feature for this right to self-determination. But in today's context, this self-determination idea is again coming up in different forms, particularly in terms of this ethnic strife and ethnic turmoil in different parts of the world, and therefore this becomes a major challenge for the nation state. And United Nations still has a very well considered position on this question of self-determination, that in what context self-determination is to be recognized or considered or adjudged a legitimate demand or legitimate process, and in what context it has to be de-recognized and delegitimized. But nonetheless, self-determination is another important challenge, along with, as I mentioned, secularism, democracy, a number of issues which are basically staring in its face, along with the process of capitalist globalization, because globalization is at times referred as a direct assault on the concept of sovereignty, which became the hallmark of Westphalian state after 1648. So how this globalization, in era of globalization, nation state is surviving, and because it has survived the attack by Soviet internationalism, the communist internationalism, as I was mentioning earlier, it has survived United Nations multilateralism, but this new challenge of capitalist globalization and its new assault on this idea of nation state is becoming a very hot topic for discussion in social science and comparative politics. Now, one thing is to be understood here, that nationalism today, as I discussed under 4-5 different headings, that democracy, self-determination, secularism, globalization, and also human development index. These 5 important factors have to be considered when we discuss this entire idea of nation state in today's context. One thing cannot be underestimated, the challenges which are emanating from another source, that is called religious fundamentalism and global terrorism on the question of nation state and nationhood. So these two issues are also basically the issues before the United Nations, because this is becoming a major challenge for the nation state so far as its survival is concerned. But nonetheless, along with these two issues, religious fundamentalism, sectarian strife, ethnic nationalism, along with the challenges of harmonizing democracy and nation state, the idea of self-determination among various groups, communities, ethnic groups and communities and cultural communities in the world, and secularism, globalization and human development index. When I talk of human development index, we simply talk about poverty, hunger, well-being, health, education, and other indicators of human development index as perhaps drawn by United Nations and many such agencies. So these things are also going to determine the legitimacy of nation state in the eyes of the people, that how it is a legitimate identity for the people, because it cannot be simply hollowed out from within. In fact, in today's world, our nation state cannot command obedience of the people or the legitimacy in the eyes of the people unless it addresses these questions. And therefore, what we have seen in context of recently Arab Spring in the West Asian continent, when the entire West Asia was in turmoil on the issue of democracy, though the nation states there emerged in a different context, in context of imperialism and colonialism, but because it didn't address the question of these human development index and democracy, how people simply revolted and refused to recognize nation state as a viable and legitimate identity. So these are the challenges of nationalism today, which we will basically take up in the next part of our discussion on this concept of nation state in comparative politics.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. Friends, we would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on another topic that is, as said by Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, that the following topic only. And friends, if you want to give your feedback, then you can write to us at info.cec@nic.in. The lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube soon. So we will be meeting soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.